Welcome to A Healthy Curiosity, the podcast that explores what it takes to be well in a busy world with self-care strategies from Chinese medicine. I'm your host, Brody Welch, here to support you on your journey of health, happiness, and personal evolution. Welcome to today's show. I'm your host, Brody Welch, and today we're going to be talking about something that often gets overlooked when we think about weight loss. There's so much emphasis on what we need to be putting into our bodies, on getting just the right diet that's going to somehow keep our bodies exactly at the right optimal weight for our entire lives. Only recently have the awareness that what of eating is just one piece of the puzzle. There's also the when of eating and, of course, the how of eating. And for listeners to this podcast, we often talk about the importance of doing things like relaxing and chewing and making sure that you're in a state where you're ready to digest, and also the importance of allowing some rest in your digestive system, because everything in life happens according to this pulsation of on and off. And that in the yoga tradition we call spanda, and in Chinese medicine, the idea that each organ system is responsible for doing its job during particular times. And there's times when the energy is just not there and times when it is really on. So today we're going to talk about the when of eating in a way that's been getting a lot of attention lately. There's a trend in the fitness and wellness world known as intermittent fasting. And my guest today is Dr. Stephanie Estima, who is going to unpack intermittent fasting for women. Dr. Stephanie Estima is a big-hearted, energetic, and compassionate healer who's dedicated to changing lives through evidence-based health strategies like nutrition, fitness, and mindset. She has a background in neuroscience and psychology, and she earned her Doctor of Chiropractic degree at the Canadian Memorial Chiropractic College. She's especially interested in brain optimization, longevity, and weight loss, and is a female biohacker, former figure competitor, and is interested in the application of the ketogenic diet, fasting, and fitness in women. She runs an online program called Keto Clean, which is kind of a plant-based approach to ketogenics. Dr. Stephanie Estima, welcome to A Healthy Curiosity.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
I have a lot of questions for you, but let's start with something pretty basic, and that is, why is it that we need to be thinking about intermittent fasting as it pertains to women as opposed to just men and women, humans in general? Why do women need to be thinking about diet and weight loss differently?
This is a really great question, Brody, and this is where I have really spent a lot of my time thinking about and developing strategies around. In clinical practice, when I have been taking patients through a weight loss protocol, one of the first patterns that I noticed was, a guy would be like, yeah, I started doing your Keto Clean diet or your fasting protocol, and I've lost, in the first couple of weeks, they've lost 10, 15 pounds. And women would be like, yeah, I've lost 1. And it's very much highlighted, especially in couples. We'd have a male and female partner, and they'd be eating the same things at home, but we would see the guy losing quite a bit of weight, and the female counterpart would be lagging behind there. In the most simplest terms, I think one of the reasons why females have a harder time with weight loss in general is because we're more complex. We look at guys, we look at their biology, we look at their hormonal environment. And when we compare that to a female's hormonal landscape, it is quite different. And we also see other lifestyle factors come into play, being pregnant, postpartum, not necessarily nutritionally recovering from pregnancy, diving into being a mother and the lack of sleep thereof, and, all these other kind of socioeconomic factors that we see. But when we kind of break it down into its simplest terms, we know that a woman has far more changes in her, not only just month to month in terms of having a period or a menstrual cycle, but over the course of her life, there's a lot of hormonal changes that happen. So we have different environments for a woman when she is premenstrual, during her fertile years, and then peri and postmenopausal. There's a completely different hormonal environment there as well. So the short answer is, we're more complex. And we have to be looking at some of the, our hormones rule our metabolism, right? So this is just, basic physiology. And when we have more things at play, there are different strategies that have to be implemented for a woman. compared to a man.
And it makes a lot of sense, right? Like that that biologically, if you're not eating in the morning, for example, cortisol levels could rise. Your body might think you're going to die that day. And so that it needs to hang on to every ounce of fat that it possibly can, especially if it's on women to be growing new life, potentially, whether or not we actually are. It's kind of irrelevant if it's in the hormones. Is that a part of it?
Yeah, if you're a woman, you defend your fat far more fiercely than a man will because of what you just talked about. If you are sort of in those, when you are having a regular menstrual period or in your, fertile years, when you are reproductive or able to reproduce, whether or not you want to is irrelevant, but your body will hold on and defend its fat stores much more vigorously than a male counterpart who's the same age.
Yeah. My husband calls the differences between men and women and certain men and certain women, especially, as a certain level of chemical privilege that he gets to enjoy that I don't enjoy, right? Just that idea of being things are a little bit more steady and constant. And so like, because yes, women, we're a little bit more complicated. We've got more going on. So given that we're more complicated, how does this fit into the context of intermittent fasting? And maybe you could take us through what intermittent fasting is and why it's popular right now and why it's something that we're even having a conversation about.
Sure. Before I do that, I would just like to maybe also mention when we are looking at intermittent fasting and its applications for females, one of the things that we have to be very cognizant of, and this is why it's really important to be working with somebody who understands female biology and female physiology and its application in clinical practice. We often see a lot of women, especially in terms of like the patient population that I see, this is where I draw a lot of my knowledge from. They've often had a child, the child is like, let's say 10 years old, 15 years old, and they've never really fully recovered from that pregnancy. And when we are pregnant and we are, all of our nutrients, all of our biology is directing the nutrients to that baby. So after we give birth to that baby, a lot of women, most women, we dive into breastfeeding and all the sleeplessness that goes on there. And we don't fully recover in terms of we are very much, most of the women that I deal with, they're sort of 40 and up. We are very much devoid. Our nutrition or our nourishment at the cellular level is very low. So it's important to be considering for a woman, especially as we get into this conversation around intermittent fasting, that she doesn't have the same, she won't be able to go for longer periods of time without taxing her adrenal glands. As you were saying, you mentioned cortisol. So our cortisol levels are already probably too high to begin with. And that's, of course, I'm making, broad statements here. And
most people are stressed. I think that's a safe statement that most people are stressed, which is going to correlate with elevated cortisol until you get to the point where you're depleting yourself, at which point it could go low. But I think it's not particularly risky to say that most women are stressed out.
Right. And, there are different levels of adrenal insufficiency as well. So as you mentioned, most people are stressed. So, we kind of pop in and out of stage 1. But as we move into a stage 2 or a stage 3, where there's complete collapse in the adrenal's ability to produce cortisol, you also, as a female, you will start stealing from the production of your sex hormones, so your estrogen levels, in order to be creating more cortisol. So we become what's called cortisol resistant, meaning that your body, cortisol is like a counter-regulatory hormone. So it really is important in countering inflammation. So when we have cortisol being released, it has an anti-inflammatory effect. That's what it's supposed to do normally. But when we have too much cortisol being released, which is, as you said, for a big part of the population, what we start to find is that the efficacy of that cortisol starts to reduce. And this is what is known as cortisol resistance. So your body has to actually create more and more and more. And for a woman, that tends to happen at the expense of her estrogen.
Which makes a lot of sense, right? That if you're in a fight or flight situation, if you're worried that you might not survive, which our bodies basically, I mean, even if your mind understands that a work deadline or letting someone down isn't a life or death situation, our bodies will still operate as though it is, and that it's going to prioritize getting us out of a dangerous situation over our ability to reproduce. So it's it biologically makes sense, but applied to the modern world, it's it's still, we have to remember that our biology has been influenced that this is a factor. We're going to act as if this is life threatening.
Right.
So, and you mentioned like that after giving birth, after nursing, after jumping back into the workforce, or that women are often in a state of depletion in addition to stress, and so it sounds like certainly from a Chinese medicine standpoint, getting those women to build back their qi in their blood, to renutrientify their lives is pretty important. And so it sounds like that would not be an optimal time to jump into intermittent fasting. Is that what I hear you saying?
I wouldn't necessarily say that it's not an optimal time to jump into it. I think that there's a lot of benefit from practicing intermittent fasting, but there's just different ways that I think a female should be practicing it. So whenever we look in sort of the fasting world, and even in the ketogenic world, we see a lot of some of the thought leaders tend to be men, and they've done a lot of self-experimentation on themselves, which is awesome, but it doesn't necessarily cross over to the female application of fasting. So in terms of fasting for a woman, usually how I like to start, if you've never fasted before, just know that fasting has kind of been around for centuries, right? Like we have it's just super popular right now because with the popularity of keto and fasting, like they're very much a wonderful marriage and a wonderful coupling. But, fasting has really been around for centuries. When we think about Christians who fast, during Lent, we think about Muslims who fast during Ramadan. There's ample examples of people fasting over mainly for religious reasons. Now we have sort of the benefit of doing studies and looking at some of the physiological benefits of fasting. It is being applied more and more in terms of helping men and women with insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, people with aberrant or abnormal lipid profiles, things like that. So for a woman, I love for females to start off with a 12-12 intermittent fast protocol. And what that basically means is that you have an eating window of 12 hours, and then you have a complementary 12-hour fast. So there's 24 hours in the day. So most of the 12-hour fast is going to take place while you're sleeping. And your eating window is going to be like in a 12-hour eating window. So, the clock starts, let's say 7 o'clock, you come downstairs, you have your coffee with your breakfast or what have you, it would be 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And for the most part, that's super doable for most people, male or female. It's just really about getting into the habit of sticking relatively closely to a 12-hour fast. A lot of times what I find when females are coming to me in practice, like, oh, well, I have dinner at 7. And then, I sit down and I start watching whatever show, and I'll grab myself a glass of wine and maybe some chips and crackers. But when we think about sleep, this is a really big thing for most women. I find a lot of females have difficulty falling asleep and staying asleep. And part of that is because we are eating later and later into the evening. So a 12-hour fast is where I like to start people. We see a lot of benefit with all the things I just said in terms of allowing your insulin levels to drop, allowing your leptin levels to drop, allowing your cortisol levels to drop. And then once that 12-12 rhythm has been really established, then I do like to tighten up the eating window a little bit. So an 8 or a 9-hour eating window is what I love most people to be doing most days. So that allows for, 15 or 16-hour fasting window. And as it relates to females, when we think about specifically breast cancer, actually, before I even dive into that, I will say that going from a 12-hour fast to a 16-hour fast, we see really big changes in terms of cardiovascular health for females. And when we look at like the number one thing that kills most, like the number 1 and 2 killer for females is like heart and stroke and cancer. So tightening up your eating window for a female to 8 or 9 hours is really going to help your cardiovascular, your heart health. And the other thing it helps with is breast cancer. So there was a really, really great study, and I'll be super happy to share it with you and your audience, Brody, where they looked at women who had breast cancer, and they started a time-restricted eating window of 8 or 9 hours. So they ate for 8 or 9 hours, and they had that complementary 15 or 16-hour fast. And it actually didn't matter what they ate. So this is why this study is so amazing. Like they were able to eat whatever they wanted, but as long as they kept in that 8 or 9 hour window, they found that the recurrence of breast cancer was reduced by 40%.
Oh, that's wonderful news on all fronts. And with the cardiovascular benefits, I'm curious if you could say more about that, like if you have a sense of why that's the case and what benefit is seen.
In terms of heart health.
Yeah, heart health and reduction in heart attacks and strokes.
What we tend to see when somebody is fasting is we see your triglyceride levels improve. So one of the things that we know when you're eating a lot of carbohydrates is that your liver will now start to push out more triglycerides. And when we think about, atherogenesis and atherosclerosis, it's not because we're eating too much cholesterol, by the way. Like, that is a really big fallacy that has been pushed for a long time. Makes no sense. Like, every single cell in your body makes all the cholesterol that it needs. But what we do see is when you are, fasting is an absence of food, right? So if you're not having carbohydrates, your triglyceride levels are lowering. And that will, when we are looking at plaquing of the artery, it is because of the breakdown of triglycerides and the oxidation and the oxidative damage that happens. So fasting and things like restricting your carbohydrates, which is, why keto tends to be so popular, really does help with reducing some of the arterial damage and the atherogenesis or the atherosclerosis that can happen.
Thanks for filling that out a little bit more for us. That's great. I wanted to also just mention that I love that you started with 7 to 7, because in Chinese medicine, there is this notion that the spleen and stomach, the organs that are primarily responsible for digesting and absorbing our food, that they kick in and they have their peak time at 7 a.m. to 11 a.m., which means they have the least amount of qi in them, according to theory, between 7 p.m. and 11 p.m. And so it's like not a great idea to be eating between 7 and 11 p.m. for the reasons that you mentioned. Like, we shouldn't be digesting our food while we're sleeping. That can definitely interrupt our sleep. It's a great idea to stop eating within 3 hours of sleep so that digestion can happen and so that the liver and gallbladder can clean the blood at night, which is kind of their peak time, according to Chinese medicine circadian rhythms. So it's just an interesting place to start. And what you're saying definitely makes sense, that the body starts, as those triglyceride levels lower and less oxidative stress, then healthier hearts. Fantastic.
The lovely thing around that as well is when you are not eating late at night, piggybacking on what you were talking about with the liver, we have these internal clocks in our bodies, right? We have a master clock in the brain. It's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And then that master oscillator, that master clock, will talk to different clocks in the brain, in the body rather, and that main one being the liver. When you eat food, your liver is going to be one of the main organs that's going to help with the metabolism of that food or the energetic breakdown of that food. So if you are eating late at night, your peripheral oscillator in your liver is going to say, oh, there's a lot of energy coming in, I must rev up the system. But your brain is seeing the dark outside. You have melatonin that's starting to be produced. And there's a dissonance, if you will, between the sort of a central and peripheral oscillator. So I really do encourage most women, if they can, to stop eating at about 7 or 8 o'clock, or at least, depending on whatever your schedule is, like 2 to 3 hours before you go to sleep, to allow for emptying of the stomach and for the liver, like the job of the liver to sort of quiet in terms of breaking down food.
Yeah, because we definitely don't need to be eating those calories before going to sleep either. And so it's essentially it's telling the liver to go ahead and store this as fat instead of using it, which isn't really what we want.
Mm-hmm.
This episode is brought to you by the coaching branch of BrodyWelch.com. If you are interested in getting off of your plateau, I have 3 opportunities for you. One is to join a community of like-minded people who similarly want to get more calm, more confident, be in the bodies that they love, show up differently in the world, and start really living from their truth. My Level Up community starts again in January. And if you're interested, you can head to BrodyWelch.com, Level Up page, and apply. Also, there is room in the Mexico retreat in February for a few more people. So if you could use a retreat that gets you connected to yourself, as well as giving you tons of self-care tools for your toolbox going forward, check that out as well. And 3, I'm opening up time in my schedule for a handful of the right one-on-one clients for coaching for people who are interested in getting off their plateau, with kind of a combination of both health coaching and life coaching from a Chinese medicine framework. So again, all the self-care tools and empowerment, support, accountability that you could get in a group, but with some more personalized recommendations from me. And if you're interested, head to brodywelch.com, go to the Level Up page and apply to have a conversation with me, and we'll see if it's a good fit. Now back to the show. So starting with a 12-hour eating window and then tightening that up, you said to about an 8-hour eating window?
Yeah.
Okay. Is more better? Like I know that there can be perfectionists or people who are kind of competitive in nature who are like, I'm going to go for just eating one meal a day, or like, is there such a thing as too much?
Well, I think it depends on your metabolic flexibility, how easy it is for you to switch from using glycogen as your energetic source versus ketone bodies, which is another alternative fuel source that we endogenously produce or we produce inside the body. I would really want to understand before making other recommendations, like how, what your metabolic flexibility is. Are you obese or not, right? Like, is your BMI or is your, the amount of excess adiposity or excess fat on you an issue? I typically practice, so I do a 16-8. So I have an 8-hour eating window every day, and then I fast for 16 hours. But I do throw in a 24-hour fast once a week. So I do like one day a week where for me, it's usually like a mid-afternoon. I eat at 2 or 3 o'clock, and then I don't eat again until the next day. I do that once a week, but that's just something that I enjoy doing. I find that nobody really notices anyway. Like, I'm working, nobody notices whether or not I'm eating. So I would recommend as a next possible step, for sure, adding in a 24-hour fast. But when we start thinking about longer fasts, we also, for a female in particular, we want to be taking into account her adrenal health, what her leptin levels are like. If a female who has excess adipose tissue or excess fat on her body, she is going to be secreting more leptin, because that's where leptin is a hormone that is released from the adipose tissue. And we have to really be looking at whether or not her leptin signaling to her brain is appropriate. So leptin is like our satiety hormone. It keeps us like feeling full. When you have something called leptin resistance, which happens a lot in women, what we find is that your leptin levels are high in the body, but your brain isn't picking it up. So you tend to overeat a lot. So someone who is not responding appropriately to leptin, I would absolutely recommend a longer fast for her. Like anything, you have to build up tolerance to it. You can't just jump into a 3-day or a 5-day fast, especially if a woman has cortisol insufficiency or cortisol resistance that we were talking about before.
So in other words, if a woman feels hungry a lot, then she actually would benefit from a 24-hour fast.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the thing about hunger is, I think we've really been marketed to in such a way that we feel like as soon as hunger strikes, you have to like squash it with some 100-calorie snack or something. And hunger is just, it comes in and it goes. Like I always like to liken it to, waves in an ocean. Like they sort of crash into the shore and then they recede. A lot of times when we think we're hungry, we're actually thirsty. So before, grabbing 100-calorie snack, which tends to be super high in carbohydrates, which, kind of circling back to what we were talking about before, increases triglyceride production, it would be important to make sure that you are hydrated, because we often don't feel thirsty until we are already dehydrated. So a constant stream of water in the body is super important as well. Yeah.
Yeah, recognizing that we don't have to scratch every itch when we're meditating. Like, we don't actually have to respond to a feeling of hunger by eating. Like, we can allow it to be, we can drink water, we can investigate what it's like to feel empty. It's a different way. And there's sometimes some clarity that comes with fasting, and some mental clarity.
Oh yeah, lots of people fast for that very reason. They fast to be able to solve problems or to improve, productivity, creativity, focus. Yeah.
I feel like there could also be a downside where, especially in diet culture, where women have been, we're bombarded with these messages about how our bodies should look, that women who may have developed eating disorders, it seems like it could be a slippery slope from intermittent fasting to how little eating can I get away with. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think you have to, when we are thinking about applying a fasting protocol to women, you have to take into that emotional component. There is society, very much a societal directive for women to look a certain way. But the type of fasting that we are talking about is really geared towards improving, not only longevity, which is how many years you live, but your health span. So it's like there's no sense in living a long life if you're sick, right? So fasting is one of those protocols that can really hack into living longer, but also making sure that those longer years that you're here, that you're healthy. It is what would be described or maybe called a hormetic stress. So it's a stress on the body, but it activates pathways that help with healing and help with increasing lifespan.
Yeah, and I think we would all agree that it's much more about quality than quantity when it comes to life.
Right.
In terms of different people doing better or worse with an intermittent fasting protocol, in Chinese medicine and Ayurveda, there's this notion of constitution, right? So that people who tend to carry extra weight, we would think would tend to do better with eating maybe only twice a day, or like in an 8-hour eating window, as opposed to someone who has a lot more kind of the air and ether elements at work, where they really do kind of need to ground themselves with food 3 times a day or so. And obviously we don't want to be basically cramming the tube that is our digestive tract full all the time. We want to be leaving space for those digestive organs to do their work. I'd like for you to just speak to this idea of meal spacing versus snacking all day. Like also just with blood sugar, it's one of those things that we're taught, or there was this mythology of like, oh, to keep your blood sugar stable, we need to be eating every 2 hours, and how like that trains the body that it needs to be fed every 2 hours, instead of really allowing us to get down into a fat burning mode where we are able to not only lose weight, but detoxify from the toxins that are stored in our fat. So I'd just like for you to speak to how we can balance, like for someone who does have like maybe a Vata constitution in Ayurveda, who really like kind of needs to eat 3 times a day. Does that make sense in an 8-hour eating window? Or like what is your experience there with respect to the constant grazing versus actually eating meals?
I am not a fan of constant grading in any shape or form. And the reason I think one of the biggest lies that we've been told to is just what you had said. We need to be eating every 2 hours, and you always need something in your mouth that's going to stoke your metabolism, or it's going to keep your blood sugars stable. Like this is all absolutely not supported by science in any way. I mean,
Yeah.
in the same way that, if you had to go, the example I like to give is like, if you had to go to the bathroom, you wouldn't just go to the bathroom and just let a little bit of pee out and then stop and then wait a couple hours later and then, go back to the bathroom and have a little bit more and do a little bit more. Like you would go to the bathroom, sit and have a proper void, right? It's the same is true for eating. You should sit down, be super, like I'm a really big fan of being super grateful and appreciative of the food that you're about to eat, but have a proper meal so that you feel full at the end of that meal, and then allow for a break. You would never go to the gym and just train biceps every single day, all day long. You would go there and maybe one day you do arms and the next day you do legs. And the reason for that is because you're allowing for the muscles to repair and to rest. In the same way, your digestive system needs to have periods of rest where you're not constantly bombarding it with food. And you will, with that, you will get spikes in hormones like insulin. And that can come from carbohydrates, or too much protein can also spike your insulin as well. So we want to be really mindful of allowing the digestive tract to heal. What we see now, and it's almost like it's a pandemic almost. I have most people that I work with have some sort of GI distress through the day, meaning that they will eat something and then afterwards there's some kind of distension, uncomfortable, there's gasiness, there's bloating, what have you, because they have been used to for many, many years eating all the time. And you don't need to eat all the time. Our genes and the pathways that we have in our body have evolved over tens of thousands of years to allow you to sit down for a meal, but then you don't necessarily need to eat again in 2 or 3 hours. You can, and when we think about our ancestors, they were nomadic, they were hunting all day long. Our women were gathering berries all day long and tending to our children. They were moving all day long. So you don't necessarily need to be eating all the time. And I'm a really big proponent for allowing the digestive system to rest, allowing your insulin levels to fall, and for allowing some of the benefits like, creating your own, like using up your glycogen stores, kicking into your own production of ketone bodies so that you can help with things like the insulin resistance improving, your brain focus and productivity improving, and like our heart health stuff as well.
I love that that's your perspective, because it's certainly the perspective of Chinese medicine and Ayurveda that there is, after activity comes rest, right? After day comes night. Everything goes into this yin yang cycle of on and off, of activity and rest and recovery. And our digestive systems need that too.
Yeah.
With the intermittent fast, I want to ask you a couple of specific questions that I get from my clients. Then in my coaching program with people who play around with intermittent fasting, one of the most common questions is, does coffee with no cream, no sugar, does that count as breaking the fast?
Great question. And it depends on who you ask.
Okay. What's your view?
I am a fan of lots of water, herbal teas during a fasting period. I'm okay with a cup of black coffee as well. In my Keto Clean program, we do allow for a cup of bulletproof coffee. So that would be, people who are very new to keto, we allow them like basically an MCT or coconut oil, potentially some butter in your coffee as well, because it's basically coffee with fat, and fat has almost a negligible effect on insulin levels. So I would say if you are new to fasting, I would probably try to go as long as you can with water, with herbal tea. Black coffee for me is okay, because the amount of, a cup of coffee I think has 4 calories in it. So it actually takes more energy for your body to make use of those 4 calories than it does the actual caloric consumption. When you have mastered the time restricted eating of 12-12 and then 16-8, I do like to just have a black coffee. So initially I will sort of allow for some fat in the morning, some sustenance. That's especially important for women. But as you increase your tolerance and you increase your fasting muscle, if you will, I do like to take the fat out, and I like it to just be water, liquid.
Or the black coffee.
Or the black coffee.
Okay,
yes.
got it. So in other words, if you're getting up, if you're trying to do a 16-8, but you're having a cup of black coffee before your other food, you're still good. You haven't broken that. Okay. Yeah. That's because it's really the carbohydrate that is the trigger.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Got it. And the bulletproof is an exception at first because it allows your body to continue to kind of be in a fat burning mode. You're not giving it carbs.
You're not giving it carbs. And especially for women, when we think about, we mentioned before that women really do defend their fat stores. So as like when we are first training a female body to be going for longer periods of time in between her meals, what we can start to do is, if we don't do it properly, we can start messing around with her periods. So I do like to give fat in the beginning during that adaptation phase. And then we phase it out.
Great to know. The other question that I have that I get a lot is people who are perhaps pre-diabetic or are headed down that way, like people who have blood sugar issues. Mm-hmm. I know that intermittent fasting is something that can be tremendously beneficial in balancing blood sugar and reversing that trend towards diabetes. But I'd like for you to speak to kind of like, is that safe to do? Or is this the kind of thing that someone is going to really need to be working with a doctor on?
I would always recommend working with somebody who can help you monitor things as they go. So my preamble to that is, if you have a doctor that you know, like, and trust, I would absolutely be working with them. If you're wanting to go at it alone, I wouldn't really recommend doing anything longer than a 24-hour fast. But when we are thinking about people who are pre-diabetic, they're developing insulin resistance, which is the big problem. That's sort of the hallmark of especially we're talking about type 2 diabetes, where the cells are now no longer responding to insulin in the way that they previously were. We see receptors on the cellular level, like the receptors for insulin, start to turn off, so we can't get glucose into the cell for proper cellular metabolism and production of energy. The benefit is not that we're getting rid of the blood glucose from the blood, but we are improving cellular response to insulin. Because you'll find, and what I found is, even with, and that's the thing that's going to shunt the blood glucose, like the glucose in the blood, away from that. So that is the huge benefit for someone who is a type 2 diabetic or pre-diabetic, or someone who's dealing with metabolic syndrome. And even with females, when we see women with PCOS, one of the big hallmarks for polycystic ovarian syndrome is insulin resistance. And there was actually a really cool paper that came out, I think it's 2, 3 weeks ago now, where they were able to demonstrate that artificial sweeteners, things like sucralose and sweet and low, and these things also, even though they're not real sugar, quote unquote, they actually have the same physiological effect on, like you still have that insulinergic response. And then that signaling of the, like you need to produce more and more and more insulin for the cells to respond, which is what is, that's what we call insulin resistance.
Yeah.
So fasting is a really important part of reversing that. And it is one of those things, I'm a really big fan of applying fasting in populations like that, because it is, when we look at a type 2 diabetic, for the most part, this is a lifestyle disease. It is a preventable lifestyle disease. It's hard to medicate your way out of a problem that you behaved your way into, right? So this is a way to sort of reverse the physiological effects of a poor behavior.
Well, and it makes so much sense, right? If that the cells are so numb to the constant barrage of sugar that they're like, I'm not listening. I'm getting inured to the stimulation here. It's like, how do you get them to be more sensitive? It's like you deprive them of that sugar for longer periods of time, and then the body starts to respond. That disease of resistance goes away.
Exactly.
I'm curious about stevia, because I see a lot of people who are doing keto or who are trying to get away from artificial sweeteners, but also sugar in general, that like lean heavily into stevia and xylitol and things like that. What's your take?
I'm okay with stevia. I'm okay with monk fruit, xylitol, erythritol, anything with an OL at the end of it. This is a sugar alcohol. So it's not technically a sugar, but it still goes through the same metabolic pathway in the bodies. And if any of you have ever had things that have a lot of sugar alcohol in them, you also know that it causes quite a bit of GI distress, like quite a bit of distension and bloating and gassiness that results from it. For sweeteners, I like stevia. It's a based off a plant, right? We're talking about the stevia leaf. So I'm okay with that, and monk fruit as well.
Great. I'm curious about your Keto Clean program, because keto, for those who are not hip to the keto movement, a lot of people, a lot of people are just living off of like heavy cream and bacon, or like this idea of the more fat the better, and that it doesn't really matter where it's coming from, but it's like it's kind of that fat and protein, carbs are the enemy. And to me, it's the kind of thing where I'm like, if my carbs are coming from broccoli, I don't think that's a bad way of being. So I'm curious as to what's involved in your Keto Clean program, and why do you advocate it?
Yeah, I am just like you said. If I'm getting some of the benefits of broccoli from kale, from bok choy, from arugula, from asparagus, like I'm completely okay with that. The Keto Clean program is basically a plant-rich diet. So we have a lot of green leafy vegetables, which, like to pull broccoli as an example, like super rich in sulforaphanes, which has there's anti-cancer properties in there. There's like cellular renew, like there's so many great things that I'm not a big fan of. Like you said, sour cream and bacon and butter and burgers and every day, all day. When we think about playing the long game, when we think about longevity, it makes absolute no sense to be consuming those things all day, every day. And they can really, depending on someone's genetic profile, you can really create quite a bit of inflammation in the body from that. If you have a sensitivity to dairy and you're having a tub of sour cream every day, or, tons of cheese. And so the Keto Clean diet is basically very much a green, leafy vegetable, very vegetable rich diet, and where we have, sort of fat as a fill. And then, you can do it whether you're vegetarian or you're a meat eater. And if you are a meat eater, then we really do encourage you to have moderate to low levels of protein, meaning that I want you to look at protein as your meat as a condiment rather than kind of the main course. And that's not to say that you can't have like a beautiful ribeye steak once in a while, but like it's really the 80-20 rule, right? What you do 80% of the time is going to produce most of the results that you have. So I'm super, it's very much green leafy vegetables, lots of nourishing fats. They tend to be polyunsaturated fats, monounsaturated fats. So lots of, fats from nuts and fish and olive oil, things like that. And protein, if you're meat eater, then it's whatever protein you love. And we also have vegetarian options as well.
Well, it sounds quite Mediterranean almost.
Yeah, it is. And when we think about the amount of fiber that we see in some of the green leafy vegetables that are encouraged on Keto Clean. These things are like, fiber is not, especially insoluble fiber, these things are not absorbed by the body. So what they do is it goes through the intestinal tract, and we have, it bulks up the stool, it tracks water to it. So you're really moving. Like, one of the big complaints about people who do like a classic, or what I'd like to call a dirty keto, is they have constipation issues. Like, they go on keto and all they're having is bacon and butter and burgers and sour cream and whatever, and they stop going to the bathroom. And it's because there's no fiber in their diet. They've taken
that just, even just hearing that, it makes me cringe. That sounds awful.
So this way of eating will help with your, with your decreases in your transit time, ease your passing, having a regular bowel movement every day is super important to your health. So that's something that's really encouraged. And we also talk a lot about resistant starches as well, in terms of feeding the microbiome and optimizing the bacteria that's in the microbiome.
And could you just define resistant starch for those who may not know?
Sure. Yeah. So a resistant starch it sort of sounds like its name. It's a starch that resists digestion. So very similar to fiber, where we have insoluble fiber is not able, like the carbon chains are not able to be broken down in the body. A resistant starch is the same idea. So, some common examples of resistant starches would be like green bananas, cold rice, cold potatoes. Raw potato starch is another one that we use a lot in Keto Clean. Like, another thing that a lot of people find on keto, especially women, is like 2-3 weeks into like a classic or dirty keto diet, they're like starving, and it doesn't matter what they eat. They can have all the fat in the world, but their microbiome is essentially starving. And that what you end up craving is like carbs. And a lot of women who have tried dirty keto before, they just end up overeating with like pizzas and bread and pastas and whatever. But when you are applying or you are consuming resistant starches on a daily basis, you are feeding the microbiome, or you're feeding the bugs in your gut, and they in turn will produce something called the short chain fatty acid, which is, when you are trying to achieve a state of ketosis, is really important, because the short chain fatty acid will eventually also be cleaved and turned into a ketone body.
And it's so interesting that things like rice that has been cooked and then cooled has the resistant starch, in a way that white rice, when you make it, is absolutely the opposite of that. Like, that's basically just a starchy carb.
Yes.
So interesting. Anyway, Dr. Stephanie Estima, you have been a wealth of knowledge. I really appreciate you helping bust some myths around intermittent fasting, and especially how it applies to women. If people want to connect with you, where should they go?
I would love it if you are interested in the Keto Clean diet and working with me, ketocleandiet.com. And you can register for masterclasses that we hold all the time. Or you can find me on Instagram, Dr. Stephanie Estima.
Thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure talking with you today.
And you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening today. For more episodes of A Healthy Curiosity, you can visit the iTunes store. If you appreciated today's show, please leave us a review. This helps other people to find the podcast. You could also head to brodywelch.com, where you can find free self-care resources, learn more about Chinese medicine, and let me know what you'd like to hear about on future episodes. I'd love to hear from you. Till next time, be good to yourself.